The courtroom was still, as if the very walls held their breath. Dr. Webb, grey-haired and meticulous, rose from his chair and adjusted the spectacles that slid down his nose. He drew a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of dust and candle smoke lingering from weeks of trial. "Entry point," he began, voice clinical but steady. 4 inches below the left clavicle. Bullet trajectory slightly upward. Death would have occurred within minutes from massive internal bleeding. Each word was precise, deliberate, stripping away the mythos surrounding Colonel Greenidge in favor of stark reality. A man dead, lying in a barn, pierced by iron and intent. Hemphill's voice cut sharply through the hushed courtroom. Was the colonel armed? The question was loaded, a single word of accusation aimed like a pistol at the jury's perception of the defendant. Webb shook his head. No weapon was found on his person. The pause stretched. Hemphill leaned forward, his face tightening. Could this have been an accident? Webb hesitated. He had studied the wound, mapped it against the barn's floorboards, the angles of the rafters. The trajectory was clean, deliberate. The proximity and angle suggest intentional aim, he said finally, his voice devoid of drama. But the courtroom felt the weight of it all the same. Across the room, Chamberlain's sharp eyes caught the pause, the room's shifting moral balance. His cross-examination was surgical, brief but potent. "Dr. Webb, you investigated Klan activities in Union County. Was Colonel Greenidge the leader of that organization?" Hemphill bellowed, rising to object. "Objection. The colonel is not on trial. He's the victim." Judge Bond's gavel struck once firm. "His character is relevant," he ruled. "Answer the question, Doctor." Webb's eyes flickered to the jury, to the faces of 12 men who had yet to absorb the weight of the moment, and then back to Chamberlain. He felt the tension between professional detachment and the pressing social truth. The history that hovered around this courtroom demanded honesty. He cleared his throat. Based on testimony and documentation, yes. Colonel Greenidge was identified as the Grand Wizard of the Union County Klan. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. Greenidge was no longer a neutral landowner, no longer merely the victim of a violent act. He was a man who orchestrated terror, who manipulated fear, who had led systematic campaigns against black citizens for years. Chamberlain let that answer hang in the room, heavy as the summer humidity that clung to the courtroom walls. And did that organization engage in terrorism against black citizens? He pressed, his voice measured, allowing gravity to guide each syllable. Webb's answer came quietly but firmly. The evidence suggests systematic violence and intimidation. For a brief moment, morality itself seemed to tremble on the scales. The victim was a terrorist. The accused, a blacksmith, was painted in a new light. A man confronted with terror, with impotence, forced to make a choice no law could justify, no authority protect him. The prosecution's first witnesses were called over the next 2 days. 5 white men, all present at the barn that night, took the stand. Their testimony was as synchronized as a regiment on parade. Rainey had burst in unprovoked, shot an unarmed man, and fled. Not one mentioned why they had gathered there. Not one acknowledged the Klan by name. Their silence screamed louder than their words. The jury listened, uneasy, because even in recounting the facts, the undercurrent of intimidation, the unspeakable threat that had shaped that night was deliberately omitted. Then Chamberlain began presenting the witnesses for the defense. Reverend Elias Hill rolled slowly to the stand in his wheelchair, each movement a testament to the costs of neutrality. His legs were useless now, a cruel monument to a night where law and justice had failed him. Hill's voice was soft, yet it carried across the courtroom like a hammer striking metal. He described the night riders, the masked figures of terror, the beatings, and Sheriff Moore's commands echoing over them. He recounted the futile reports, the dead letters from the authorities, the endless waiting for protection that never came. Hemphill attempted to exploit Hill's suffering, his voice rising in indignation. "Why didn't you fight back?" he demanded, trying to cast Rainey's actions as unnecessary, even monstrous. Hill's gaze lifted slowly, sorrow coiled in the depths of his eyes. "I believed in the law," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I believed if I followed every rule, if I did everything right, eventually justice would protect me." He gestured toward the legs that no longer moved. "I was wrong." The courtroom absorbed the truth of that confession. There was no malice in Hill's words, only a devastating honesty. The law had failed, and the powerless remained prey until someone else acted. Sarah Perkins followed, her testimony a quiet, searing portrait of community terror. Her home had been burned, her children terrorized, her husband whipped for attempting to register to vote. She spoke of lives constrained by fear, of a society where peaceful avenues of resistance were systematically closed. Each word drew a map of oppression, a topography of terror that contextualized Rainey's decision. Major Lewis Merrill, in crisp military precision, presented documents and reports, evidence of the Klan's organized conspiracy, proof of collusion with local authorities, the cumulative record of black citizens attempting every legal recourse available. Chamberlain turned to him deliberately. "In your military experience," he asked, voice carrying the weight of logic and morality, "if soldiers are under attack and their commanding officer refuses to defend them, do those soldiers have the right to defend themselves?" "Yes," Merrill answered firmly. "Self-defense is a fundamental right. Does that right disappear if the soldiers are black and the attackers are white civilians?" Chamberlain pressed, his eyes locking onto the jury, challenging each man to confront bias. Merrill's voice was unwavering. "No, constitutional rights don't change color." The courtroom shifted again. Context had built a fortress around Rainey's single act. Years of terror, repeated denial of legal protection, peaceful measures exhausted. The question was no longer merely whether he had killed a man, but whether killing a man who wielded terror with impunity constituted murder or justified self-defense. On the fourth day, James Rainey himself was called. The courtroom fell silent as the blacksmith walked forward. Hands rough and scarred from decades at the forge gripped the Bible, his eyes fixed on the jury, each man of color and history evident in the lines of his face. He did not apologize. He did not perform contrition to comfort white sensibilities. He was present, human, undeniable. Chamberlain asked gently, "Mr. Rainey, tell the jury why you went to that barn on March 18th. "I went to learn who was ordering the raids against my community," Rainey said. "I went to gather evidence so federal authorities could arrest them. I brought a weapon for protection. Yes, but I did not go there planning to kill anyone." The barn, once a place of fear, now loomed large in memory, the rafters echoing with history and decision. "What happened when Colonel Breenidge saw you?" Chamberlain asked. Rainey's voice caught, steady but raw. "He recognized me, called me by name, and I knew if I didn't act in that moment, I'd be killed, and the terror would continue. So I made a choice." Hemphill rose again, aggressive, seeking to dismantle Rainey's story. "You claim self-defense, yet you brought a loaded weapon. You claim no intent to kill, yet you aimed for the chest. You claim to defend your community, yet your actions brought reprisals. How is this defense?" Rainey met his eyes squarely, truth laid bare. "When the law protects everyone equally, I'll use the law. Until then, I use what's available. I'm sorry Colonel Breenidge is dead, but I'm not sorry my community isn't subjugated anymore." The courtroom absorbed that answer, a single shot reverberating through decades of terror, oppression, and lawlessness. Not dramatic, not performative, simply honest. And it was enough. The moral question had shifted in that barn, in that courtroom. The shot had been fired, the body had fallen, and the law had begun to wrestle with the truth it had too often ignored. A black life defending itself against white terror could, under the right scrutiny, be recognized as self-defense. The trial had just begun, and yet the echo of that bullet already carved a path through history. The night hung heavy over Union County, the air damp with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Shadows crawled across the fields like sentinels of fear, and in the distance, the faint outline of the barn where the shot had been fired still lingered in memory. The men who had witnessed the terror knew that what happened in that barn was only the apex of years of systematic violence, a violence meticulously masked, hidden in the ordinary routines of the county. Reverend Elias Hill remembered it all. He sat before the courtroom in his wheelchair, hands folded over each other, knuckles white. His legs, now useless, bore witness to what neutrality had cost him. Hill spoke slowly, deliberately, each word weighed with the authority of lived experience. "They came at night," he began, voice quivering but clear. Masked men, horses' hooves stomping on the soil, whips cracking, voices barking orders. Sheriff Moore himself guided them, as if we were animals in a pen, and he were the master. The courtroom was silent except for Hill's wheeze of breath, the subtle shifting of jurors in their seats. Hemphill's brow furrowed, trying to construct a narrative of passivity to make Hill's suffering a justification for Rainey's supposed criminality. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked, his voice sharp, straining for indictment. Hill looked past him, past the gallery, his gaze distant yet all seeing. "I believed in the law," he said quietly. almost reverently, as if speaking the creed of a world that had abandoned him. "I believed if I followed every rule, did everything right, eventually justice would protect me. I was wrong." His hands, trembling slightly, gestured toward his legs, limbs rendered useless not by age but by terror sanctioned in lawlessness. The courtroom absorbed the weight of it. Here was a man crushed by both cruelty and the absence of protection. Sarah Perkins followed, her testimony painting in broader strokes the terror that had gripped her family and neighborhood. Her house had been burned. The charred remains of walls still whispered of fear and helplessness. Her children had cowered, too young to fully understand, but old enough to remember the night's terror etched into their minds. Her husband had been whipped for attempting the simple act of registering to vote, a crime punishable not by law, but by the clandestine enforcement of fear. Perkins' words built a mosaic of oppression. It was not random, nor isolated. It was a deliberate, calculated system of control. Men like Rainey, who acted in moments of desperation, were not merely criminals, they were defenders responding to a vacuum of justice that had persisted for years. Major Lewis Merrill presented the meticulously compiled evidence, reports, affidavits, sworn statements, each one a testament to the organized, insidious nature of the Klan. Merrill's military precision left no room for doubt. The Union County Klan was not a loose band of vigilantes. It was an organized terror network with reach into local law enforcement. Black citizens had exhausted every legal recourse. Peaceful protest had yielded nothing. Systematic violence persisted unchallenged. Chamberlain, eyes keen, pressed on. "In your military experience, Major, if soldiers are under attack and their commanding officer refuses to defend them, do those soldiers have the right to defend themselves?" "Yes," Merrill replied. "Self-defense is a fundamental right. And does that right vanish if the soldiers are black and their attackers are white civilians?" "No. Constitutional rights do not change color," Merrill answered firmly, without hesitation. The courtroom seemed to shift, the air vibrating with the implications. The act that had put Rainey in jeopardy, the single shot fired in a darkened barn, now rested in the context of decades of terror, repeated denial of legal protection, and relentless systemic oppression. The question was no longer only whether he had killed Colonel Breenidge, but whether he had done so in defense of life and community under conditions that left no legal alternatives. Then came James Rainey himself. He walked with deliberate slowness toward the witness box, blacksmith's hands gripping the Bible, every muscle and tendon in his frame visible in the strain and discipline of years at the forge. He did not hurry. He did not falter. He looked at the jury with steady eyes, not pleading, not apologizing, merely present. His humanity was impossible to ignore. Chamberlain's voice softened. "Mr. Rainey, tell the jury why you went to that barn on March 18th. "I went to learn who was ordering raids against my community," Rainey began. "I went to gather evidence so federal authorities could arrest them. I brought a weapon for protection, yes, but I did not go there planning to kill anyone." The memory of the barn was a living entity, the rafters and the dusty floorboards still recording every movement, every heartbeat. "What happened when Colonel Breenidge saw you?" Chamberlain asked. Rainey's voice, measured and unwavering, carried across the room. "He recognized me, called me by name, and I knew that if I didn't act, I would be killed, and the terror would continue. So I made a choice." Hemphill rose, voice raised, pacing the courtroom, trying to break the narrative. "You claim self-defense, yet you brought a loaded weapon. You claim no intent to kill, yet you aimed for the chest. You claim to defend your community, yet your actions brought reprisals. How is this defense?" Rainey's eyes met his, steel and truth. "When the law protects everyone equally, I'll use the law. Until then, I use what's available. I am sorry Colonel Breenidge is dead, but I am not sorry my community is no longer subjugated." The jury felt the weight of those words, not theatrics, not performance for sympathy, just a truth that defied decades of social expectation. A black man had acted to defend life, liberty, and community in a system that had failed to protect him. Outside the courtroom, Union County's streets whispered with tension. The verdict had yet to be delivered, yet its inevitability rippled in the undercurrent of fear and anticipation. The white community feared precedent, worried that Rainey's justification could empower resistance, threaten hierarchies long maintained through terror. The black community, cautious and weary, dared to feel a spark of hope, aware that even a legal vindication could not erase the scars, the burned homes, or the terror that had shaped their lives. The night riders, now absent from the immediate scene, remained spectral presences in every shadowed corner. Their reign had been interrupted by federal authority, by one man's courage, But the structures supporting that terror, the economic control, the legal complicity, the social enforcement of fear remained. Rainey's bullet had struck one target, but the system itself was vast, durable, patient. By the time Rainey left the witness stand, the courtroom had absorbed the full force of context. The shot in the barn was no longer a single act of violence. It was a nexus of history, oppression, desperation, and calculated defense. The jury would not decide in a vacuum. They had been presented with a living archive of terror, with the human face of resistance, with the unvarnished truth that law and justice are not always aligned. Rainey returned to his table, hands folded, eyes steady. The barn, the bullet, the terror it had all led to this room, to these witnesses, to this moment of reckoning. The question hanging in the air was not merely guilt or innocence. It was a question older than the courtroom itself. Can justice exist when systemic oppression has denied the means of lawful protection? And the echoes of that night, the hooves, the whips, the screams, the fire, the terror would not be confined to memory. They were stitched into the legal argument, into the jury's moral calculus, into the very definition of self-defense that would determine James Rainey's fate. The barn had been more than a building. It had been a stage for history, for law, for courage, in the face of insurmountable odds. The shot fired within it was small in sound, but immense in consequence, reverberating across lives, across communities, across the fragile landscape of justice in Reconstruction-era South Carolina. The courthouse in Union County was a building of faded grandeur, a monument to order that had too often failed to uphold justice for black citizens. On the morning the trial began, June 4th, 1871, the wooden floors creaked under the weight of expectation. Journalists, spectators, and townsfolk filled every available seat. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the unspoken anxiety of a community watching history unfold. Outside, the summer sun glinted off the windows, making the inside of the courtroom feel darker, heavier, as if the walls themselves absorbed the dread of decades of terror. Judge Bond, a man whose hair was thin but whose eyes remained sharp and uncompromising, called the court to order. His gavel struck the sound block, reverberating through the hushed room. The trial of James Rainey, the blacksmith who had fired the bullet that ended Colonel Breinage's life, was now in session. The murder charge was first degree, a weighty accusation, yet the circumstances surrounding the shooting were far from ordinary. The prosecution was led by Hemphill, whose reputation for aggressive courtroom tactics preceded him. He began by framing Rainey as a dangerous man, a single bullet fired with reckless disregard for law and order. He painted images of chaos, of black men emboldened by the audacity of violence, suggesting that a conviction was necessary to prevent further lawlessness. Hemphill's words were carefully measured, designed to exploit the deep-seated fears of his mostly white audience. The first witness was Dr. Webb, the county coroner. Webb had examined Breinage's body with clinical precision. He described the entry wound just below the left clavicle, the trajectory of the bullet, angled slightly upward, the massive internal bleeding that would have caused death within minutes. His words were cold and factual, yet in their starkness they carried a weight of inevitability. "Was the colonel armed?" Hemphill asked, his tone demanding moral judgment. Webb shook his head. No weapon was found on his person. The implication was clear. Breinage was defenseless, yet his death had occurred at Rainey's hands. Chamberlain, representing Rainey, was deliberate in his cross-examination. "Dr. Webb, you investigated Klan activities in Union County. Did Colonel Breinage lead that organization?" Hemphill interrupted immediately, shouting an objection, but Judge Bond overruled him. "The character of the victim is relevant," he said. "Answer the question, Doctor." Webb hesitated, caught between professional integrity and social pressure. Based on testimony and documentation, yes, Colonel Breinage was identified as the Grand Wizard of the Union County Klan. And did that organization engage in terrorism against black citizens? Chamberlain pressed, leaning forward. Webb's voice remained measured. The evidence suggests systematic violence and intimidation. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to shift. The moral landscape was subtly, irrevocably altered. The man who had been portrayed as the victim was revealed as a terror leader, orchestrating attacks against those who had no legal recourse. Chamberlain let the answer linger, knowing the weight it carried, allowing the jury to reconsider the assumptions they had unconsciously brought into the room. Over the next 2 days, the prosecution called 5 witnesses, all white men who had been present at the barn. Their testimonies were coordinated, rehearsed. They described Rainey as having burst in unprovoked, shooting an unarmed man and fleeing immediately. None of them mentioned the reason for their gathering. None acknowledged the Klan by name. Their silence, deliberate or fearful, spoke louder than the words they offered. In those omissions, the jury began to perceive the contours of a deeper truth. Terror often operates in shadow, and silence can be complicit. Then came the defense witnesses. Reverend Elias Hill, a man rendered physically powerless by previous attacks, rolled into the courtroom in his wheelchair. His testimony was more than words, it was embodiment. He recounted the night riders, the beating he endured, the voice of Sheriff Moore directing the terror. He spoke of reporting the crimes, of the empty promises, of the bureaucratic impasse that left him and his community vulnerable. Hill's silence had not been weakness. It had been strategy, constrained by fear and legality. When Hemphill asked why he hadn't fought back, Hill's answer was devastating in its quiet honesty. I believed in the law. I believed if I followed every rule, did everything right, eventually justice would protect me. I was wrong. Sarah Perkins took the stand next. Her house had been burned, her children terrorized, her husband whipped for registering to vote. She described a community under siege with no legal protection, no recourse, no hope, except the desperate actions of men like Rainey, who finally said enough. The jury could not ignore the pattern emerging. Rainey's act was not a random crime, but a response to sustained organized terror. Major Lewis Merrill, a former Army officer, presented his findings. His investigation documented the Klan's conspiracy, local authorities' complicity, and the exhaustion of all lawful options. Chamberlain asked him directly, "In your military experience, if soldiers are under attack and their commanding officer refuses to defend them, do those soldiers have the right to defend themselves?" Merrill's answer was unequivocal. Yes, self-defense is a fundamental right. Chamberlain pressed further, "Does that right disappear if the soldiers are black and their attackers white civilians?" Merrill's voice carried across the courtroom, deliberate and firm. No, constitutional rights do not change color. The defense had constructed a fortress of context around Rainey's single act of violence. Decades of terror, repeated denial of protection, peaceful avenues exhausted. The question was no longer whether he had killed Greenidge, it was whether killing a terrorist who commanded local law enforcement was murder or justifiable self-defense. Finally, James Rainey himself took the stand. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he approached. His blacksmith hands gripped the Bible, his gaze steady, unflinching. Chamberlain asked, "Mr. Rainey, tell the jury why you went to that barn on March 18th. Rainey's voice was measured, carrying the weight of responsibility. "I went to learn who was ordering raids against my community. I went to gather evidence so federal authorities could arrest them. I brought a weapon for protection, but I did not go there planning to kill anyone." He described the encounter with Greenidge, the recognition, the realization that he would either act or be killed. "So I made a choice," Rainey said. Hemphill's cross-examination tried to dismantle that narrative, highlighting the loaded weapon, the aim for the chest, the reprisals, but Rainey's response was simple, unembellished. "When the law protects everyone equally, I'll use the law. Until then, I'll use what's available. I am sorry Colonel Greenidge is dead, but I am not sorry my community is no longer subjugated." The weight of Rainey's words hung in the air. They were not words of defiance aimed at the jury. They were words of truth aimed at history. For the first time in that room, a black man stood not as defendant, but as witness to systemic terror, articulating the necessity of his action with clarity and honesty. Outside the courthouse, Union County seemed to exhale a collective tension. The jury would deliberate, but the implications of this trial stretched far beyond their immediate decision. The act in the barn was transformed by context, by testimony, by the careful presentation of years of terror. It was no longer just a violent act, it was a nexus where law, morality, and survival intersected. The trial had begun as a test of individual guilt, but it had become a trial of systems, a reckoning with decades of oppression, and a question of whether self-defense could be recognized when legal structures had failed completely. Every witness, every document, every question asked and answered pushed the jury toward an understanding that this was not a simple crime, but a moral and legal paradox set against the violent backdrop of Reconstruction-era South Carolina. The barn, the terror, the whispers of the night riders, they all lingered in the courtroom, present in every word, every gaze, every pause. Rainey's bullet had struck, but the larger battle was about to begin not just in the minds of the jurors, but in the hearts of the nation, as it confronted what justice truly meant when power, race, and law collided. The courtroom's heavy wooden doors closed behind the last latecomer, shutting out the afternoon sun that had been slicing through the dust-laden air. Inside, the temperature seemed to rise, not from the June heat, but from the tension that thickened with every passing moment. By now, the jury had absorbed Dr. Webb's precise description of Greenidge's wounds, Reverend Hill's testimony of systematic terror, and James Rainey's own account of the shooting. But courtroom narratives are rarely linear. They are interrogations of truth, layered with intent and perception. And so Hemphill, relentless in method, began his cross-examinations, each question a scalpel aimed to dissect not just action but motivation, context, and conscience. First, he returned to Reverend Hill, pushing against the man's calm yet devastating account. "Why didn't you fight back, Reverend?" Hemphill asked, eyes narrowing as though a direct gaze could extract courage or confessions. Hill's quiet strength filled the courtroom. He gestured to the wheelchair that immobilized him, but the motion carried more than explanation. It carried memory, the knowledge of years of terror that had crippled both body and spirit. "I believed in the law," Hill said again, his voice low but resolute. "I followed every rule, did everything right. I trusted that justice would protect me. I was wrong." The words were not defensive, not apologetic. They were testimony. The room fell silent, the weight of decades pressing into each word, each syllable a reckoning with the failures of legal authority. Hemphill shifted focus to Sarah Perkins, the woman whose home had been burned, whose children had cried in terror while men whipped her husband for voting. His questions were framed to paint Rainey as reckless, impulsive. "Do you believe Mr. Rainey's actions caused the retaliations against you?" he asked, voice sharp. Perkins' reply was measured, her calm tone masking the trauma beneath. "Yes, but the retaliations were not random. They were directed by those who had been terrorizing us for years. He forced the attention of those who might have intervened. Before him, we were invisible to the law. Now, at least, someone was accountable." The testimony wasn't an exoneration, it was a map of desperation, showing that Rainey's bullet had pierced not only flesh but decades of sanctioned neglect. Major Lewis Merrill was next. A veteran, accustomed to violence but disciplined in law, Merrill had combed through records, traced terror raids, and documented complicity. Chamberlain framed his questions to draw a clear line between military protocol and moral responsibility. "Major," he asked, "if soldiers are under attack and the commanding officer refuses to defend them, what is their obligation?" Merrill's answer was simple, unflinching. "Self-defense is a fundamental right. It does not disappear based on color, creed, or circumstance." Hemphill attempted to unravel this, emphasizing Rainey's gun, his intent, and the potential for uncontrolled escalation. Merrill, unshaken, reiterated that self-defense is measured by necessity, threat, and opportunity. The courtroom itself seemed to lean in, aware that the questions were no longer abstract legal points but inquiries into the ethics of survival. Hemphill's tactic, familiar and forceful, sought to create doubt. If Rainey could have avoided violence, if he had foreseen retaliation, if he had chosen differently, then perhaps justice demanded punishment. But the jury, listening to a story that unfolded in sequences of terror, inescapable fear, and lawlessness, began to see the gaps in that logic. Rainey had acted in the vacuum where law had failed. The questions now only underscored the system's inadequacy. Then came James Rainey himself. The blacksmith, still scarred from his confrontation with the night riders, stood at the witness box, the Bible clutched in steady hands. Chamberlain allowed him to tell his story without interruption at first, letting the weight of personal experience carve a path to understanding. "I went to the barn to discover who was ordering raids against my community," Rainey said. "I brought a weapon for protection. I did not plan to kill anyone. But when confronted by Colonel Greenidge, I realized I had to act or die." The courtroom held its breath. These words were simple, factual, yet they carried a lifetime of fear, oppression, and decisive action. Hemphill's cross-examination sought to strip this narrative of context, framing Rainey's decision as premeditated murder. "You claim self-defense," Hemphill said sharply, "yet you brought a loaded weapon. You claim no intent to kill, yet you aimed for the chest. You claim to defend your community, yet your actions caused reprisals. How does any of this constitute defense?" Rainey met him, steady, unyielding. "When the law protects everyone equally, I'll use it. Until then, I use what's available. I am sorry Colonel Greenidge is dead, but I am not sorry my community is no longer subjugated." The words, honest and raw, forced the courtroom to reckon with the human dimensions of systemic oppression. Rainey's statement was not a plea for mercy. It was a declaration of moral and practical necessity. The act of firing that bullet was inseparable from decades of terror, complicit law enforcement, and the absence of any viable alternative. It was an existential calculus: kill to save life, or die in silence. Outside observers, jurors, and spectators could not ignore the history being laid bare. Each piece of testimony added layers of context: the burned homes, the threats, the local law's complicity, and the systematic failure to protect black citizens. The narrative that Hemphill attempted to impose a simple, isolated act of murder crumbled under the weight of historical truth. The jury was confronted with a paradox. Rainey had violated law, yet obeyed a deeper law of survival and justice. As the days of testimony continued, a subtle but profound transformation occurred. The courtroom began to understand Rainey not as a faceless defendant, but as a man inextricably linked to the fate of his community. Every witness, every document, every question and answer built a mosaic of oppression, culminating in a moment of clarity. Self-defense is not merely a reaction to immediate physical threat, but sometimes a response to systemic, pervasive danger where the law has failed to intervene. The defense had meticulously documented the landscape Rainey faced. Federal inaction, local terror, and centuries of denied rights created conditions where inaction meant death not only for Rainey but for his neighbors, his friends, his entire community. Each piece of evidence reinforced this principle. The bullet did not merely strike Greenidge, it punctuated decades of neglect, brutality, and institutionalized injustice. By the fourth day, the courtroom's atmosphere was charged not only with tension but with awareness. Every witness called, every cross-examination endured, had done more than inform. It had educated, forcing the jury to grapple with the brutal realities of Union County's social order. The question of murder versus self-defense was no longer abstract. It was a question about what it meant to exist under terror, about who had the right to live and when law failed to guarantee that right. As Rainey concluded his testimony, a hush fell over the courtroom. He had recounted his actions without theatrics, without exaggeration, without the appeasement that white sensibilities might demand. The clarity of his narrative of calculated, necessary action left the room contemplating not just the legality of a single bullet, but the ethics of resistance, the cost of survival, and the moral weight of standing against systemic oppression. Outside the courthouse, Union County's streets were tense with anticipation. Newspapers would soon fill their columns with speculation, but the reality of that day transcended headlines. This was not merely a trial of James Rainey. It was a trial of Union County, of the law, and of a society grappling with the moral and legal consequences of terror and resistance. The story unfolding in that courtroom would echo far beyond its walls, planting seeds of understanding, of discomfort, and of change, however temporary it might prove to be. By the time the courtroom adjourned for the day, the jury had received more than testimony, they had received history, compressed into 4 days of witness accounts, cross-examinations, and unflinching personal testimony. The weight of that history pressed on each juror's conscience, forcing them to consider what justice meant when the law had been absent for decades. And in that pressure, the first stirrings of doubt, understanding, and moral reckoning began to take root. June 7th, 1871, dawned with a hesitant light spilling over the courthouse steps. The trial had dragged on for nearly a month, each day a meticulous unraveling of terror, resistance, and law. Outside, Union County breathed under the heat of summer, unaware of the moral reckoning unfolding inside its walls. By mid-morning, the courtroom was packed beyond expectation. Black spectators, some still wary of the repercussions of visibility, sat alongside white citizens, many of whom carried open disdain, anticipation, or curiosity etched into their faces. Today was not about testimony or evidence. Today was about interpretation, about judgment, about where morality and law intersected under scrutiny. The first to speak was Hemphill, representing the prosecution. His opening remarks carried the authority of decades of legal practice and the blunt force of Southern social convention. He painted James Rainey as a dangerous anomaly, a black man wielding violence against the established order. His tone was carefully measured but deliberately provocative. "Gentlemen of the jury," Hemphill intoned, "we are not merely here to weigh bullets and wounds. We are here to consider what it means when a Negro takes the law into his own hands. If Mr. Rainey is acquitted, if you sanction this act, what precedent does it set? What encouragement does it provide to any aggrieved Negro who might believe himself entitled to the same?" Each word landed like a hammer striking metal, echoing off the walls of the high-ceilinged room. The images Hemphill conjured were stark, almost cinematic in their clarity. He described the barn, the bullet, the lifeless body of Colonel Greenidge. He described a world where normal social hierarchies were threatened, where the careful balance of white dominance might unravel if even one black man believed he could act without immediate consequence. Hemphill emphasized Rainey's gun, his deliberate act, and the consequences that had rippled through the white community burned barns, terrified families, economic disruptions. Self-defense, Hemphill argued, cannot be stretched to justify vigilantism. What law permits an individual to pick a target and decide when justice is served? None. Not here, not in Union County, not in this courtroom. Chamberlain rose with a different rhythm, a cadence built not on fear but on context, clarity, and moral weight. He did not deny the act. He did not soften Rainey's responsibility. Instead, he reframed the narrative, positioning the jury to see not the bullet, but the world that necessitated it. "Gentlemen of the jury," Chamberlain began, "we have heard testimony, examined evidence, and listened to stories of terror that span years. You have heard Reverend Hill's testimony, Sarah Perkins's account of burned homes and terrorized children, Major Merrill's investigation into the Union County Klan's systematic violence. And you have heard James Rainey himself, a man who acted not out of malice, but out of the pressing necessity to protect life when the law could not, when every peaceful avenue had been exhausted." Chamberlain walked slowly, deliberately, across the courtroom floor, ensuring that every juror felt the weight of history and personal responsibility. Colonel Breenidge was not a neutral citizen. He was the architect of terror, the man whose actions and leadership brought fear, injury, and death into the lives of innocent citizens. Rainey did not act in a vacuum. He acted in a context where black citizens had no recourse, where local authorities were complicit, and where federal intervention was the only shield against annihilation. Chamberlain's words resonated, framing Rainey's bullet not as murder, but as a forced response to lawlessness and systemic oppression. He continued, weaving a narrative that combined legal precedent with moral urgency. "This trial asks a simple question dressed in complex garments. Does a man have the right to protect life when the law abandons it? Does color dictate whether that protection is valid? Federal law says no. The Constitution says no. Self-defense is not conditional upon race. Yet we stand here because our society often pretends otherwise. The question is not whether Rainey killed Breenidge. The question is whether, in the absence of legal protection, he had the right to defend those who could not defend themselves." Chamberlain's closing argument was meticulous. He reminded the jury that each witness, each document, and each account had constructed a fortress of context. Rainey's actions, isolated from this context, appeared violent and unlawful, but when framed within decades of terror, systemic intimidation, and lawless authority, they emerged as acts of courage and necessity. He urged the jurors to consider the weight of years of oppression, the structural denial of justice, and the moral imperative to recognize that self-defense does not disappear because the threatened lives belong to black citizens. The prosecution's last attempt was a volley of emotion. Hemphill invoked fear of precedent, suggesting that acquittal could lead to widespread insurrection, chaos, and the erosion of law and order. But the courtroom, already saturated with the testimony of those oppressed and those who documented oppression, had begun to understand that the chaos Hemphill described was not a creation of Rainey's bullet. It was the natural consequence of decades of unpunished violence and intimidation. With the arguments concluded, Judge Bond offered his instructions with careful precision. He reminded the jury that the law allowed for self-defense when the threat to life was imminent, that systemic oppression and inability to secure protection could inform the context of perceived threat, and that they must weigh the evidence against the standards of law rather than personal biases. The instruction was more than procedural. It was a subtle acknowledgement that legal interpretation must sometimes consider the broader, grim realities of society. The jury retired at 4 p.m., 12 men locked in debate, burdened with both conscience and expectation. The halls of the courthouse emptied slowly, the echoes of words and footsteps lingering, but outside, the town buzzed with anticipation and tension. Black residents whispered in cautious optimism, aware that the jury's decision could alter not only Rainey's fate, but the fragile fabric of protection that federal authority had temporarily provided. White citizens argued in hushed tones about justice, order, and precedent, fearing that the outcome could redefine the racial hierarchy they had long assumed was immutable. Inside the deliberation room, hours stretched into the night. The jurors revisited testimony, scrutinized documents, and debated definitions of imminent threat, self-defense, and moral responsibility. They requested transcripts of Reverend Hill's testimony, Sarah Perkins' statements, and Major Merrill's investigative report. Questions arose. Did imminent threat require a gun drawn in hand, or could it exist in a landscape of systemic terror? Could self-defense justify preemptive action when law had failed to protect? Each juror grappled with these nuances, and as midnight passed, their debates became both legal and existential. The clock ticked slowly toward dawn. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but the moral gravity of their task prevented surrender. They debated not only the law but the precedent their verdict would set, the potential implications for the community, and the ethical dimensions of justice itself. By the first light of June 8th, after nearly 12 hours of deliberation, the jury believed they had reached a conclusion. They had examined the law, weighed testimony, and confronted the uncomfortable reality that their decision would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The jury filed back into the courtroom at 10:47 a.m., faces unreadable, bodies tense, the weight of responsibility visible in every movement. Rainey sat at the defense table, hands folded, staring quietly ahead. His expression betrayed no emotion, though beneath the calm, the human nervousness of a man awaiting his life's judgment trembled faintly in his fingers. The room was silent, heavy with anticipation, as Foreman Thomas Whitfield, a rail clerk from Greenville, rose to deliver the verdict. "Has the jury reached a decision?" Judge Bond asked, voice measured but firm. Whitfield's response was deliberate, the tension of months compressed into a few words. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Black spectators wept openly, cries of relief and disbelief mingling with the sharp exclamations of those stunned into silence. White spectators surged toward the exits, some in fury, others in stunned confusion. Federal troops moved quickly to maintain order, as Judge Bond's gavel cracked repeatedly, each blow slicing through the noise. "Order! I will have order, or I will clear this court." When silence returned, Bond continued. "The jury finds the defendant acted in justifiable self-defense under circumstances where legal protection was unavailable and threat to life was imminent. Mr. Rainey, you are free to go." The words took a moment to settle. Free. James Rainey, after months of hiding, surrendering to authority, and enduring a trial that examined every facet of his life and choices, was vindicated by law. For a brief moment, federal power and justice aligned to recognize a black man's right to defend himself against organized terror. But the moment was fragile, a temporary reprieve in a world still defined by systemic oppression, local hostility, and the relentless machinery of white supremacy. The courtroom's echoes had barely faded when Union County awoke to a reality that had shifted in a single moment. The verdict had not just liberated James Rainey, it had shaken the fragile hierarchy of power and fear that governed the town. Black families, long accustomed to walking with measured steps and whispered warnings, now carried a cautious exhilaration. News traveled quickly through the tight-knit communities. Mothers whispered to children, men nodded to neighbors, and every small gathering carried the electric buzz of disbelief mixed with hope. "He's free," people said, as though saying it enough would imprint truth on the world. Yet outside the safe distance of the courthouse, the air was taut with tension. White citizens, particularly those with ties to the Union County Klan, felt the verdict like a physical blow. Some were enraged beyond words, their dismay spilling into muttered threats. Others stood frozen, attempting to reconcile the legal outcome with their understanding of social order. The duality of fear and fury formed a strange, almost cinematic tableau. White households, shuttered windows, murmured prayers, and convened hurried meetings, while black residents cautiously began to reclaim space, steps careful but deliberate, aware that freedom, even legal, was still precarious. Rainey himself emerged from the courthouse with an air of quiet dignity. The months of hiding and trial had aged him, though not weakened him. His hands bore the visible proof of labor and struggle. His scarred fingers, once clenched around the blacksmith's hammer, now rested folded as he stepped into the sunlight. He did not smile, not in triumph or malice. Instead, he carried a measured calm, a weighty acknowledgement that survival carried both relief and responsibility. Federal troops flanked him briefly, not for ceremony but for protection, a reminder that liberty in Union County remained conditional. The presence of these soldiers was both reassuring and bitterly ironic. Rainey's freedom depended not solely on law, but on armed authority willing to enforce it. Black citizens greeted him cautiously. Some approached directly, offering handshakes, hugs, or tears of gratitude. Others lingered at a distance, observing, weighing whether proximity carried danger. Among these spectators, Rainey's reputation had already transcended the single act in the barn. He had become a symbol of resistance, proof that courage could challenge systemic terror and survive, if only temporarily. Sarah Perkins, whose home had burned and whose children had witnessed the violence, approached him quietly, offering a nod that carried complex emotions: relief, sorrow for what had been lost, and acknowledgement of Rainey's role in bringing temporary reprieve. He accepted her gesture with a subtle bow of his head, recognizing both the gratitude and the price of his action. Meanwhile, the white community's response was fractured. Some landowners and former Klan members convened in secretive groups, their voices low and tense as they debated how to reassert authority. The verdict was not simply unjust. It was a precedent that challenged the narrative of white supremacy. Federal intervention had ensured Rainey's legal vindication, but it had also demonstrated that black resistance, if properly framed and protected, could prevail. The implications were terrifying for those accustomed to impunity. They whispered about insurrection, questioned the loyalty of local authorities, and speculated on the limits of federal power. Some considered acts of reprisal, while others calculated patience, waiting for the moment when federal troops might withdraw and local control could be reasserted. Rainey returned to his home cautiously, aware that freedom was still fragile. The blacksmith shop he had left in hiding had been ransacked during his absence. Tools were stolen, the forge damaged, and a crude message painted on the wall read, "Dead man working." Each mark was a reminder that survival was conditional, contingent upon vigilance, and that justice, even when recognized, could not eliminate risk. He cleaned the damage methodically, his hands steady despite the emotional weight of the threat. Reopening the shop was a calculated act of defiance, a statement that retreat was not surrender, and that the skills which had always sustained him, his labor, his craft, his knowledge, would continue to define his agency. The local black community watched the reopening with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. Rainey's presence was empowering. It demonstrated that resistance could yield tangible results, yet the consequences of his bullet were immediate and unignorable. 5 homes had been burned, 3 men had been beaten, and at least 1 woman had been terrorized so severely that she could not recount the incident publicly. Rainey's vindication had provided legal protection for himself, but it could not erase the suffering that occurred in the interim. Conversations among black families oscillated between pride and caution. The message was clear: courage was necessary, but it carried real, unavoidable costs. Local newspapers reflected the deep divisions. The Charleston Mercury, a white-owned publication, framed the verdict as federal overreach, describing Rainey as a criminal who had evaded justice. The New York Tribune, by contrast, celebrated the outcome as proof that constitutional protections could be enforced and that federal law could, at least temporarily, override local racial terror. The newspaper's coverage exemplified a broader truth. Perception of justice was contingent upon perspective, social position, and political alignment. To one community, Rainey was a hero. To another, a dangerous exemplar of what they saw as lawless defiance. Political ramifications were immediate. Union County's newly empowered black citizens participated in the June elections in unprecedented numbers. Bolstered by temporary federal protection, they helped elect Republican officials committed to representing their interests, a momentary triumph that underscored the tangible impact of Rainey's actions. Yet even these gains were tenuous. White landowners and political actors, constrained by federal oversight, began to plan subtler methods of reclaiming influence. Economic coercion, social ostracism, and legal harassment emerged as tools to suppress black autonomy without triggering immediate federal intervention. The white community adapted, demonstrating the persistent resilience of systemic control even when overt violence was curtailed. Rainey's personal reflections were complex. He understood that his bullet had forced federal attention, temporarily improving conditions and preventing further overt attacks by the Klan. Yet he also grasped the fragility of that improvement. Federal authority was a shield, not a transformation. His community had gained protection temporarily, but the structures that had created the necessity for violence remained intact. Letters he penned to Major Merrill conveyed a deep ambivalence. Victory had been achieved, but it was conditional, fleeting, and insufficient to alter the long-term balance of power. For Rainey, the aftermath was a study in dualities: freedom paired with ongoing threat, legal vindication paired with community cost, courage paired with exhaustion. He resumed his blacksmith work not as a triumphant return, but as a pragmatic step to maintain agency in a hostile environment. Each strike of hammer against metal echoed the persistence required to survive under continuous threat. In quiet moments, He reflected on the lives affected by his actions: the burned homes, the terrorized children, the families left vulnerable in the immediate wake of his defense. These were consequences he had accepted, yet they weighed heavily, reinforcing the lesson that individual courage, even when justified, could never fully insulate a community from systemic violence. In the larger community, the verdict reshaped social dynamics. Black citizens gained a temporary psychological and legal foothold, but white supremacy adapted. Fear of federal prosecution curtailed overt night riding, but structural oppression persisted. Economic pressure, social exclusion, and legal manipulation became the new means of control. Rainey's victory, though significant, illuminated the partial nature of justice in a society where power, not principle, determined outcomes. By the end of June, life in Union County had adjusted to the new equilibrium. Federal troops remained, serving as both shield and reminder that true freedom was contingent. Rainey's shop reopened fully, some black residents regained a degree of autonomy, and the broader political landscape reflected tentative progress. Yet the psychological scars of terror and the structural inequities of local power endured. Community conversations balanced pride in survival with sobering acknowledgement that systemic change required more than individual heroism. It required sustained enforcement, collective mobilization, and vigilance against the ever-present threat of retaliation. The courtroom had released James Rainey, but Union County remained a tense stage where victory was only partial, and the aftermath of his action rippled in ways that no verdict could fully control. In the weeks following the trial, Rainey returned to his blacksmith shop to find the consequences of his survival had already begun to manifest in subtle, calculated forms of retribution. Tools were missing, the forge had been sabotaged, and walls bore crude warnings. Yet nothing in these damages matched the deeper, structural pressures that would shape life for Rainey and the community. The white citizens, barred by federal oversight from open violence, began to exert control through the economy, a slow, persistent form of intimidation that required no masks, no midnight rides, only the weight of social and financial power. The reopening of Rainey's shop on Calhoun Street became both a statement and a test. Black customers trickled back, cautiously, their loyalty tempered by fear. White customers approached with suspicion, their greetings perfunctory, and some refused outright to cross the threshold. Neighboring counties became alternative markets for the white population, diverting business away from Rainey. The economic pressure was deliberate. The intent was clear. If you cannot punish him with law or violence, punish him with livelihoods, with reputation, with exclusion. Rainey, aware of this, worked methodically, keeping the forge hot, repairing tools, and serving those who came, black or white, understanding that every transaction was a negotiation with risk. Each hammer strike on the anvil was an assertion of agency, a demonstration that survival required skill, persistence, and courage beyond the courtroom's recognition. Yet, even as he persisted, the broader social retribution unfolded like a calculated strategy. White landowners refused to rent property to black families associated with Rainey. Contracts for work, trade, or construction vanished quietly. Local merchants avoided credit or trade arrangements with those who had supported him. The repercussions were not instantaneous violence, but the slow, grinding pressure of economic exclusion, forcing families into precarious positions. A household could remain physically safe but socially and financially vulnerable, a condition that produced long-term stress, subtle humiliation, and a sense of enduring surveillance. Rainey understood that the same system that justified his self-defense legally could still trap him socially. Survival in Union County required more than the protection of federal troops. It required constant vigilance, careful alliances, and strategic visibility that did not provoke retaliation. Within the black community, Rainey became both a symbol and a liability. Families acknowledged the temporary reprieve he had achieved through his trial, yet they also bore the costs. Homes had been burned in the days immediately following the shooting. Children had witnessed terror that no legal verdict could undo. The question weighed heavily in community gatherings. Could one individual's courage produce collective safety, or did it merely shift danger to others? Sarah Perkins, her burned home slowly repaired, offered what some interpreted as a measured approval, saying quietly to Rainey, "Your shot bought time, but the cost is still counted in smoke and screams." It was a reminder that legal vindication could coexist with real suffering, that resistance, even when justified, carried moral and practical consequences beyond the immediate act. Federal troops remained stationed in Union County, a buffer between overt violence and subtle, persistent intimidation. Their presence prevented open night riding, arrests went forward, and the law's temporary authority overpowered the Klan's masked tyranny. But as the weeks passed, the troops' footprint was both protective and limiting. They could enforce order in the streets, but they could not intervene in every economic transaction, every social slight, or every silent rebuke that marked daily life for black citizens attempting to rebuild after terror. Rainey's victory, therefore, existed in a constrained bubble. His legal freedom was undeniable, but his practical freedom was still negotiated constantly, a fragile balance maintained through personal vigilance, skill, and courage. The economic isolation extended into subtle acts of social ostracism. Neighbors avoided greetings or small talk. Public spaces became uncomfortable arenas for black families asserting autonomy. Rainey's shop, once a communal gathering place, became semi-public, its door open but guarded by wary trust. White citizens, leveraging social networks, controlled access to markets, supplies, and labor. They could not openly terrorize under the eyes of federal oversight, but they could channel resources, influence contracts, and regulate social interaction to impose compliance without bullets. The pressure was invisible to outsiders, but palpable to those living under it. Survival required understanding the invisible map of power that extended beyond legal rulings. Rainey learned quickly that every customer's hesitation, every diverted contract, every whispered warning from a neighbor reflected a system still stacked against him. Even federal authorities could not solve all problems. While prosecutions against remaining Klan members had succeeded, the economic and social infrastructure of white supremacy remained intact. Courts still often favored white litigants in civil matters. Local sheriffs, constrained by federal oversight, could still exercise discretion that favored old social hierarchies. Rainey's shop became a nexus where law, survival, and community intersected. Each transaction a negotiation not only of metal and money, but of power, perception, and prudence. The forging of iron mirrored the forging of strategy, persistent heat, controlled force, and an understanding that resilience was built slowly, strike by strike, decision by decision. Rainey's own reflections during this period reveal the complexity of victory. Letters he wrote to Major Merrill documented both gratitude and anxiety. "I am free," he wrote, "but freedom in Union County is not the same as safety, and safety is not the same as justice. I can defend myself in court, yet cannot defend my neighbors in the streets or my family from social starvation." These words captured the duality of legal vindication and lived reality. The trial had proven a principle: black self-defense could be justified under federal law. But it had also exposed the limitations of law when it conflicted with entrenched economic and social power. Survival, as Rainey quickly realized, required not just courage in the moment of violence, but strategic patience, social navigation, and continued resilience. Economic pressures also reshaped communal behavior. Black citizens, observing the subtle retribution enacted against Rainey, learned to navigate a system that rewarded caution over courage. Trade networks adjusted, neighbors monitored one another, and the lessons of resistance became intertwined with lessons of prudence. Survival required selective visibility, when to assert autonomy, when to conceal strength, and how to leverage federal protection without provoking countermeasures that could undo progress. Rainey's experience became both example and cautionary tale, demonstrating that the fight for dignity and rights was as much about social and economic strategy as about legal or violent action. Even as months passed, the shadow of the shooting lingered. White citizens continued to whisper, conspiring in subtle networks of intimidation that the troops could not entirely dismantle. Rainey's shop, a center of craft and symbol of resistance, became a battleground of perception. Every transaction, every interaction, carried weight. The small victories achieved in court could not erase the larger structures of oppression, and Rainey's daily life reflected the intricate balance required to sustain both personal and communal survival. By the end of the summer, Rainey's assessment of his position was sober. His legal victory had disrupted terror temporarily, but it had not transformed society. Economic pressure and social retribution were effective, invisible forms of control that would persist long after headlines faded. Rainey recognized that freedom, especially for black citizens in Union County, was conditional and contingent. Survival required courage, skill, and relentless vigilance. Legal vindication could secure a moment, but systemic change demanded continuous engagement, collective action, and sustained enforcement conditions only partially met in Reconstruction's fleeting window. The federal garrison stationed in Union County had been a tangible shield, a wall of authority between lawless white supremacists and the black community they terrorized. Soldiers patrolled the streets, arrested night riders, and maintained a semblance of order that would have been unthinkable just months before. James Rainey, now legally vindicated, understood the fragility of that protection. The moment of triumph was complete only on paper. In practice, the county remained a battlefield of tension, intimidation, and deferred justice. Summer stretched into September of 1871, and with it came the faintest whispers of political recalibration in Washington. President Grant faced mounting pressure from northern legislators eager to cut costs and shift attention to emerging issues elsewhere. Federal troops in the South were expensive, logistically complex, and increasingly politically divisive. Union County was a small node in a network of counties under federal occupation. To Washington, it was just another ledger entry, a line item in a budget debate where the lives of freedmen were balanced against political expediency. On a humid morning in early October, Rainey witnessed the first signs of the shift. The garrison's numbers began to shrink, from 200 soldiers down to 40, a reduction described in terse military dispatches as strategic reallocation. To the untrained eye, the decrease seemed bureaucratic. To Rainey and the black citizens of Union County, it was a signal. The walls of protection were receding, leaving communities exposed to both direct and indirect forms of intimidation. Rainey's vigilance, once reinforced by federal authority, now depended entirely on local calculations, alliances, and personal resilience. The Klan did not immediately reassert its masked violence. The convictions, federal oversight, and public scrutiny kept their more flamboyant tactics at bay. Yet the absence of federal enforcement soon revealed a more insidious, patient strategy. White landowners, merchants, and community leaders who had been restrained by the garrison began leveraging subtler methods of coercion. Economic exclusion, employment manipulation, and social ostracism became primary instruments of control. Homes of black families experienced delayed repairs, trade networks shifted away from black-owned businesses, and opportunities for upward mobility became conditional on acquiescence to white authority. Rainey saw it all unfold, as though observing a tide slowly pulling back, revealing dangers once submerged beneath federal oversight. The federal troops' contraction had immediate consequences. Rainey's blacksmith shop, once buffered by soldiers' presence, became a microcosm of the larger power struggle. White customers returned slowly, often testing boundaries, measuring the extent of federal reach that still applied. Contracts for work outside the county became less frequent. Rainey realized that the victory of law was temporary, the enforcement of law was not, and that the political will of distant officials could vanish with equal speed. Each transaction, each customer interaction, was now an assessment of risk, what could be tolerated, what provoked retaliation, and how federal absence altered every social dynamic in real time. Even within the black community, the withdrawal of federal protection necessitated adaptation. Families that had once relied on soldiers' presence for safety had to rethink daily routines. Walking to church, attending school, or traveling for trade became exercises in risk assessment. The principle of self-defense that Rainey had asserted in court could no longer be assumed to offer practical security. Laws existed, but enforcement was contingent, conditional, and increasingly fragile. Black citizens began implementing subtle strategies, watch networks, shared intelligence about suspicious movements, and the strategic movement of children and property to minimize exposure to covert forms of harassment. Rainey himself participated in these networks, his blacksmith hands as busy crafting survival strategies as they were forging iron. As the federal garrison diminished, the Klan and other white supremacist networks began leveraging the legal system itself. Sheriff Thomas Moore, who had been constrained under federal scrutiny, began reasserting his influence. Local courts, no longer under the constant gaze of federal authority, leaned subtly toward white litigants. Civil penalties, zoning decisions, and the allocation of county resources reflected the old hierarchy re-establishing itself under a veneer of legality. The tools of oppression had shifted from masks, torches, and whips to property codes, local ordinances, and social enforcement. Rainey recognized this as a systemic evolution. The overt violence had receded, replaced by structural coercion that was harder to detect but no less effective. Rainey's personal vigilance increased. Each day required a careful assessment of threats, economic opportunities, and the well-being of his family. Federal soldiers, once a constant backdrop, now appeared in sporadic patrols, responding primarily to incidents that had escalated beyond local control. The absence of immediate protection meant that the black community could no longer rely solely on law or the precedent of his trial. They had to create their own mechanisms for survival. In effect, Rainey's bullet, which had forced federal intervention, had brought only temporary security, not lasting peace. The political climate in Washington mirrored the erosion of protection on the ground. Northern Republicans, fatigued by Southern occupation and concerned about budget constraints, began advocating troop withdrawals across the South. Media debates framed the discussion around economic efficiency rather than civil rights, emphasizing the cost of soldiers over the human cost of their absence. To Rainey, these discussions were abstract until they translated into the reduction of troops, leaving the county more exposed with each fiscal directive. Federal protection, which had once been a reliable instrument, became a contingent variable, dependent on political calculations far removed from Union County's lived reality. By late October, the reduction in troops was tangible. The 40 remaining soldiers could not patrol every district or respond rapidly to emerging threats. Rainey and his neighbors observed the same individuals once constrained by military oversight testing boundaries, probing the limits of tolerance. Economic pressure intensified, and social coercion became more visible. Letters and rumors of intimidation circulated. White citizens who had remained restrained now engaged in subtle harassment doors, left unlocked to signal surveillance, property inspections, and business refusals. Rainey adapted, but he recognized that the underlying threat had not vanished. It had simply changed form. The erosion of federal authority had wider consequences for the black community's political agency. With the troops present, voter intimidation was reduced, and local elections reflected the brief period of Reconstruction's promise. As soldiers withdrew, the mechanisms of political suppression, legal loopholes, procedural obstacles, and economic pressures resurfaced. The rights temporarily secured through federal enforcement became fragile, contingent on the continued willingness of distant powers to intervene. Rainey witnessed the slow dismantling of political leverage, understanding that the gains of Reconstruction were always temporary unless backed by sustained federal and local commitment. Rainey's reflections during this period, recorded in letters and diaries, reveal his profound awareness of the tenuous balance between legal victory and practical freedom. "The trial gave me life," he wrote, "but life without protection is like a forge without iron. The heat exists, but the structure cannot hold." He understood that law alone could not guarantee safety or justice. Federal presence had provided a narrow window for empowerment. Its gradual withdrawal exposed the persistent vulnerability of black citizens who dared assert autonomy. Survival required constant vigilance, strategic alliances, and an acute understanding of both overt and covert forms of control operating within the county. The gradual withdrawal of federal protection did not produce immediate chaos, but it did restore the systemic pressures of subjugation. White elites, constrained only by the limited oversight of soldiers, employed economic, social, and legal tactics to reassert dominance. The black community adjusted, navigating a landscape where autonomy was measured in strategic calculation, where personal courage could only carry so far without institutional reinforcement. Rainey, legally vindicated but socially embattled, became both symbol and strategist, embodying the tension between principle and survival. By the end of the fall of 1871, Rainey's assessment was sober. The bullet that had forced federal intervention had created a temporary buffer against violence, but the structures of oppression persisted, adapting to new conditions. Survival required resilience, intelligence, and constant adaptation. Legal victories mattered, but they were insufficient without sustained enforcement and systemic change. Rainey's life had become a study in the limitations of law when political will shifted, a cautionary illustration of how legal vindication could coexist with social vulnerability. By the winter of 1871, James Rainey had returned fully to his blacksmith shop, his hands scarred but steady, his presence both reassuring and intimidating to those who knew his story. Charleston offered relative anonymity, a place where the shadows of Union County's violence receded, yet the lessons of survival remained vivid in every decision. His shop on Calhoun Street became more than a place of work. It became a hub for quiet resilience. Black families came not just for repairs or tools, but for guidance, for counsel, for a demonstration that defiance could survive outside the courtroom. Rainey's shop was modest. A single forge dominated the back room, coals glowing like embers of his own stubborn will. Tools were hung meticulously along the walls, not just for efficiency, but as symbols of skill, discipline, and continuity. He worked long hours, forging horseshoes, plows, and everyday implements that tied the black community's survival to his craftsmanship. But his labor carried a dual purpose. The physical objects he shaped served practical needs, while his very presence conveyed a subtler message of endurance, a living proof that a black man who stood against terror could persist, could thrive. Family life, however, was an ongoing negotiation between hope and caution. Rainey married Rebecca in 1880, a woman of quiet intelligence and enduring strength. She had been a teacher in a freedmen's school, dedicated to the education of black children at a time when such pursuits were both illegal and dangerous. Together, they raised 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son within the tenuous margins of Charleston's black community. Each day required careful calculation. Children were taught to read and write in secret, in rooms locked from prying eyes, learning history and arithmetic alongside the unspoken lesson of vigilance. Rainey's son, James Jr., watched his father forge metal with hands that carried both power and precision, learning the language of labor and survival simultaneously. The blacksmith became a quiet leader in the community. He was no politician, no orator. His leadership was pragmatic, forged through example rather than rhetoric. People came to him for advice, often in hushed tones. They sought strategies to avoid confrontation, to navigate legal ambiguities, to protect property and family without provoking the latent hostility surrounding them. Rainey advised with a careful balance of moral clarity and tactical acumen. He emphasized preparedness, understanding threats, knowing allies, and recognizing when federal protection might be leveraged or relied upon. His counsel reflected the bitter lessons of his trial. Law alone could not protect, courage alone could not suffice. Survival demanded both. Economic pressures remained constant. White citizens, embittered by his past actions and the federal vindication that had accompanied them, engaged in sustained resistance. Some refused service, avoiding his shop entirely. Others attempted to negotiate patronage under implicit threats. Rainey's clientele fluctuated, requiring him to carefully balance engagement with cautious withdrawal. In some cases, he provided services under the radar, discreetly ensuring essential tools reached families whose livelihoods depended on them. The blacksmith shop, like Rainey himself, became a fulcrum of quiet empowerment, a place where agency was exercised under conditions of constant risk. Despite the precariousness of daily life, Rainey maintained a disciplined routine. Dawn brought the first light across the forge, and he began work immediately, shaping iron and steel into forms that symbolized both productivity and resistance. Every swing of the hammer echoed lessons from the past, a rhythm of endurance and control. Each tool crafted carried dual meaning: practical utility for survival, symbolic assertion of presence and capability in a world that sought to erase both. His craftsmanship became intertwined with pedagogy, a subtle demonstration that labor, skill, and knowledge were forms of resistance against systemic oppression. Rainey's household functioned as both sanctuary and instruction center. Children learned practical skills alongside literacy. They observed the delicate balance between assertiveness and prudence, witnessing firsthand the ways in which survival required negotiation, discretion, and strategic courage. Rebecca instilled moral and intellectual foundations, emphasizing the importance of understanding both law and context. Together, they created a microcosm of resilience, a family unit designed not only for daily survival, but for imparting knowledge, discipline, and the principles of measured resistance to the next generation. Socially, Rainey navigated a landscape shaped by both fear and respect. Black citizens viewed him with reverence for his trial and the courage it represented, but also with anxiety, aware that his prominence made him a target. White citizens alternated between grudging recognition of his skill and persistent resentment. Interactions required constant evaluation: what could be tolerated, what constituted provocation, how federal oversight might intervene if limits were tested. Rainey's life became a continuous negotiation with power structures, a demonstration that freedom was contingent and vigilance was perpetual. Community cohesion relied heavily on informal networks. Neighbors shared intelligence, coordinated small acts of mutual defense, and provided subtle economic support. Rainey played a central role in these efforts, his trial experience providing both a template and a warning. The blacksmith organized communication channels, advised on legal recourse, and emphasized the importance of maintaining composure in the face of systemic harassment. His counsel was pragmatic, recognizing that survival depended less on heroics and more on strategic action, collective vigilance, and mutual aid. In public spaces, Rainey was deliberate in demeanor. He avoided unnecessary confrontation, yet remained unflinching when principles were challenged. Stories of his trial and vindication were told sparingly, often coded in conversation, never flaunted in a way that would provoke reprisals. He understood that survival and leadership required a careful choreography of visibility and discretion. The blacksmith's life was both emblematic and functional, a continuous demonstration of measured defiance, resilience, and the art of living within a hostile social framework without surrendering integrity. Through the 1,880 seconds and 1,890 seconds, Rainey's influence extended subtly into civic and social spheres. He mentored younger black men and women, teaching trade skills, literacy, and strategic self-defense. He emphasized that empowerment was cumulative and fragile, built on both personal discipline and collective action. The community learned to navigate increasingly complex legal and social structures, translating lessons from Rainey's experience into strategies for survival, education, and economic self-reliance. His guidance reinforced the idea that individual courage, when combined with communal cohesion, could produce incremental but meaningful stability, even under conditions of systemic oppression. Yet the shadow of systemic suppression loomed. The withdrawal of federal oversight meant that legal protections were inconsistent, vulnerable to local reinterpretation, and ultimately contingent on power, influence, and proximity to white authority. Rainey recognized this truth with sober clarity. His own trial, once a beacon of justice, now served as a cautionary example. The law could vindicate courage, but only temporarily and only under conditions of external enforcement. Survival, not triumph, became the guiding principle for himself, his family, and his community. Rainey's role then was simultaneously heroic and pragmatic. He represented the possibility of resistance while illustrating the limits of individual agency against structural oppression. His life was a study in endurance, the ability to maintain dignity, provide for one's family, educate the next generation, and sustain a community in the face of persistent, adaptive threats. He had survived bullets, legal proceedings, and systemic intimidation, yet the daily battles of survival were equally consequential, if less visible. His story during these decades demonstrated the practical realities of freedom in a society where legal vindication and lived liberty could diverge dramatically. The blacksmith, father, and community leader embodied a dual legacy. His past act of self-defense had established a precedent. His ongoing life demonstrated the limitations of that precedent when enforcement faded. Every interaction, every decision, and every act of guidance was a living experiment in navigating a hostile society with intelligence, skill, and resilience. Rainey's household became a quiet school for survival and agency, a place where courage and prudence coexisted, and where the lessons of Reconstruction were internalized long after federal soldiers had left the South. By the turn of the century, Rainey's influence was deeply felt, even if largely unheralded. He maintained his shop, mentored the community, and taught his children to live with awareness and dignity. The blacksmith's life had become a rhythm of practical resistance. Forge, family, counsel, vigilance. Each day was a negotiation between the rights secured in court and the vulnerabilities imposed by social and economic hierarchies. His existence was a testament to endurance, a demonstration that legal vindication, while insufficient for systemic transformation, could provide a foundation upon which families and communities could attempt survival and incremental empowerment. James Rainey lived long enough to see the fragile victories of Reconstruction crumble into the harsh reality of Jim Crow. By the early 20th century, the temporary protections that had allowed him to survive, raise a family, and guide his community had eroded. The laws that once backed federal intervention were defunded, reinterpreted, or ignored. Yet Rainey remained, a living testament to both the power and the limits of courage, the tension between legal vindication and social reality. His life became a quiet study in endurance, in what it meant to exist as a black man in the South after the federal will that had protected him faded. Charleston, where Rainey relocated after the final withdrawal of troops in 1877, was a city layered with contradictions. Black citizens were tolerated economically but constrained socially. Skilled laborers could find work, but visibility invited scrutiny. Rainey opened a second blacksmith shop, carefully choosing location, clients, and hours. The shop became his nexus, a place where he could provide for his family, mentor young apprentices, and quietly sustain the community. He operated within a balance of practicality and principle, understanding that outright confrontation would bring violence, while complete submission would erode dignity and hope. Family life continued as both sanctuary and classroom. Rebecca remained a central figure, teaching her children the literacy and numeracy denied to most black children by the state. Rainey supplemented that education with hands-on lessons, the forge as a site of discipline, skill, and endurance, the blacksmith shop as a microcosm of strategic thinking, resource management, and careful negotiation with social forces beyond their control. His children absorbed not just craft, but philosophy. Freedom was not given, it was preserved through constant vigilance, measured action, and community solidarity. Economic challenges persisted. White customers were inconsistent, some refusing to engage him due to lingering resentment or fear of association. Black clients often relied on Rainey's discretion, trading services quietly or using his guidance to navigate local hazards. Rainey's life was a balance between visibility and protection. Every transaction, every interaction was a negotiation with risk. He understood that the privileges he had once enjoyed under federal enforcement were now precarious, that each day required both courage and prudence. Rainey's mentorship of the younger generation became a quiet rebellion. He taught apprentices not only the craft of metalworking, but the necessity of self-reliance, situational awareness, and moral courage. He emphasized that survival was a skill as much as a principle, that intelligence and foresight were as important as strength. Lessons were subtle, embedded in everyday practice, measuring iron precisely, understanding how heat transforms metal, recognizing when a client's request was safe or potentially provocative. Every act of teaching was a reinforcement of the values that had allowed him to survive in a world designed to limit him. The broader social context, however, was unforgiving. South Carolina's 1895 Constitution effectively disenfranchised black citizens through literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements. Voting, once a hard-won victory under Reconstruction, became nearly impossible. Legal rights existed on paper but were systematically denied. Rainey observed these changes with bitter clarity. His own victory, a moment of federal recognition and self-defense, had provided only temporary respite. The systemic forces that necessitated his bullet were not dismantled, they had adapted. Rainey's own legal precedent remained technically intact, but its practical application diminished with the retreat of federal authority. Federal courts no longer intervened. Local law enforcement was increasingly controlled by men who had once sought to terrorize black citizens, and the courts interpreted law in ways that reinforced the new racial hierarchy. Rainey's shot, which had once compelled national attention and legal vindication, was now a story to be told quietly, a historical precedent largely irrelevant to daily survival. Despite these setbacks, Rainey's influence persisted. Within Charleston's black community, he was a symbol of endurance, a living demonstration that resistance was possible even when structural oppression seemed insurmountable. Stories of his trial were shared in whispers, teaching subsequent generations that courage and intelligence could assert agency even under severe limitations. These stories became part of a collective memory, a cultural inheritance of resilience and tactical understanding. By the early 20th century, Rainey was increasingly aware of the generational shift. Children born into the post-Reconstruction era experienced oppression normalized by law and custom, yet they also carried fragments of Rainey's example, knowledge that defiance was possible, that skill, intelligence, and moral clarity could carve space for survival and subtle resistance. He counseled patience and observation, teaching that open confrontation could be deadly, while strategic engagement could preserve life and dignity. The lessons were complex. Courage was essential, but so was prudence. Survival was not passive, it was active, continuous, and adaptive. In his later years, Rainey reflected often on the gap between legal vindication and lived reality. He wrote extensively, keeping journals and letters that documented both his past acts and the evolving social landscape. He recognized that his victory in 1871 had been exceptional and fragile, dependent on circumstances unlikely to repeat. The systems that had required his intervention with a gun had not been reformed. They had only been temporarily restrained. Legal recognition of black self-defense was insufficient without sustained federal enforcement, and without structural change, the pattern of terror and suppression would continue. Rainey's perspective was both pragmatic and historically aware. He understood that systemic oppression could be delayed but not eliminated through individual acts. His own survival and trial demonstrated the limits of law when enforcement waned, and the necessity of combining individual courage with collective strategy. To the young black men and women he mentored, he imparted this principle consistently. Victories must be multiplied through collective action, alliances, and persistent attention to systemic structures, or they will be ephemeral. Even as his physical strength waned, Rainey's influence endured. He was a living bridge between Reconstruction and the new era of Jim Crow, embodying both the hope and the limitations of federal protection. His children absorbed these lessons, understanding the difference between symbolic victories and practical survival. Rainey's household remained a locus of learning, discipline, and moral clarity, a place where the past informed strategy for the present and the uncertain future. By the time of his death in 1914, Rainey had witnessed the rise and consolidation of Jim Crow, the systematic exclusion of black citizens from political participation, and the persistence of social hierarchies designed to maintain white supremacy. Yet he had also left a legacy, a record of legal vindication, a model of strategic endurance, and a demonstration that individual courage, when exercised carefully, could survive even in the most hostile circumstances. His death marked the end of a direct link to Reconstruction-era resistance, but his story persisted in memory, family records, and eventually the scholarly rediscovery of black self-defense as a historical principle. The echoes of Rainey's life continued to resonate into the civil rights era. Activists and historians cited his trial as precedent for black self-defense, showing that the law could, under particular circumstances, recognize the right to protect oneself and one's community. Figures like Robert F. Williams and the Deacons for Defense drew on Rainey's example, using it to argue for the moral and legal legitimacy of armed defense when communities were under threat. The Black Panther Party, too, referenced historical instances of justified self-defense, situating Rainey within a lineage of resistance against systemic violence. Yet even as his example inspired, it also illuminated the fragility of legal protections for black Americans. Rainey's survival and vindication depended on federal intervention. Without that external force, systemic oppression would have prevailed. The pattern repeated across generations. Individual acts of courage could temporarily assert justice, but structural inequality required persistent attention, advocacy, and enforcement to sustain. Rainey's life revealed the uncomfortable truth that victory in law did not necessarily translate into lasting social change. Rainey's story endures because it challenges narratives of linear progress. It demonstrates the complexity of freedom under oppression, the interplay between individual courage and structural power, and the necessity of collective action to sustain gains. The legal recognition he secured was remarkable, yet insufficient. His survival was exemplary, yet incomplete. His legacy is a reminder that justice requires both action and protection, courage and strategy, moral clarity, and systemic enforcement. By the end of his life, Rainey embodied the tension between personal vindication and collective liberation. His bullet had struck a single man, but the structural systems that created the need for that shot remained largely intact. His trial proved the possibility of resistance, but not its permanence. Yet through his mentorship, his example, and his quiet leadership, Rainey planted seeds of resilience, knowledge, and courage that would influence future generations of black Americans. His life posed a persistent question: what is the value of courage if the systems around it are unchanged? And so, James Rainey passed away on March 22, 1914, at the age of 72, leaving behind a legacy of survival, moral clarity, and conditional victory. His story reminds us that justice is rarely absolute, that legal victories are fragile, and that individual courage, while necessary, must be coupled with collective action and structural enforcement to create lasting transformation. Rainey's life teaches that resistance matters, but its effectiveness is contingent upon the systems and institutions that support it, a lesson as relevant today as it was in the post-Reconstruction South.